Jenny. At this time, I'd like to hand it over to Claire to kick off today's bridge event. Good afternoon, Claire.
Good afternoon, Peter. Thank you so much, and welcome to everyone. It's exciting to see all the different states and jurisdictions that people are joining from, and we're really happy to have everyone joining our webinar today. And as Peter mentioned, we also have a live audience or a main audience in Puerto Rico, as this is hosted by the Puerto Rico Alliance for Dropout Prevention. That we will cover that in just a few minutes. So we will just go ahead and get started. And just to reiterate what Peter already mentioned, we have an audience in Puerto Rico, which is a large group of social workers who are working specifically on dropout prevention in Puerto Rico. And so we have simultaneous translation there, Spanish to English to Spanish. And they're there at the University of Puerto Rico. And then we have all of you joining us virtually as well. And we have today our featured presentation
Audio
by Dr.
recording
Myriam
for
Baker,
this meeting has begun.
Who is the Director of Research and Evaluation at Knowledge Universe. And I believe, as Peter also previously mentioned, this event represents a collaboration between REL Northeastern Islands and REL Pacific. And we want to thank REL Pacific for helping us to get this great presenter on this important topic. So the goals for today are that we will look at the current research on using data for decision-making in education and specific strategies for this, and most importantly, to make applications to local context and to get some discussion going and some questions and answers so that you have something to take home to your local context and put into action. And identify some key areas and next steps in Puerto Rico and in all of your jurisdictions as well. So just to review a little about the Puerto Rico Research Alliance for Dropout Prevention, which is one of the research alliances for the Regional Educational Laboratory Northeastern Islands. And the goal is to work on preventing and reducing the number of students dropping out of school. And Sandra Espada is our alliance facilitator who's in person in Puerto Rico, and I am the alliance researcher. And here you have a list of the core planning group members for the Puerto Rico Alliance for Dropout Prevention. And these are people who are local to Puerto Rico. You can see that we have representation from the Puerto Rico Department of Education and also the Institute of Statistics, College Board, the Puerto Rico Community Foundation. We've done many research studies and workshops over the past year. Here are a couple that are still in progress. An examination of the Puerto Rico school level characteristics that are related and how they are related to student graduation. We're also doing an examination of beating the odd schools in Puerto Rico, which are schools that have better than usual results as compared to schools with similar demographics in terms of graduation. So without further ado, we will turn the time over to Dr. Myriam Baker, who is the Director of Research and Evaluation at Knowledge Universe. And we want to encourage everyone to type in any questions or comments you have into the chat.
Hello, everyone. This is Myriam Baker. I am delighted to be here today, and thank you so much for the invitation. The goals and objectives, in addition to what Claire talked about, and really to reiterate those, is to help you to build your local capacity for using data to drive your decisions, to drive your actions for monitoring your programs and for evaluating your programs as well. Additionally, as part of this presentation, I hope that we will help you to identify what data you already might have to help drive that process. Often we already have tons of information at our fingertips, but it's more a matter of figuring out how to best use it. And also, we're going to introduce you to some simple tools to help you with the process. All of the information that I'm going to be covering today is going to be drawn from the guide entitled 5 Steps for Structuring Data-Informed Conversations and Action in Education. This was written by Wende Kikihio of the Pacific REL and myself when I was at the Mid-Continental Research and Evaluation Laboratory. Many of the templates, tools, and questions that I'm going to be going through in my presentation you can find in this guide, and they can be printed off and used with your team as you're working through your local context and problems. I would encourage you to get the guide off the IES website if you don't already have it, and I believe that we will have a link for you later in this presentation. Let's start out by taking a poll to learn a little bit more about one another. For those of you in our virtual audience, you'll see a poll. Please respond with the role that you identify with most closely. For those of you in Puerto Rico, please raise your hand to indicate what role you identify with most closely, starting with administrator, teacher, school counselor or social worker, parent or community member, researcher or analyst, or a different role. I see in our virtual audience the majority of folks are researcher analysts, identified almost 60% of our virtual audience. From our contact down in Puerto Rico, it looks like 40 of you indicated social worker and 2 for other roles. Thank you so much for participating in that poll so we can understand a little bit better about who we're talking to here today. So data. What is data? Well, clearly data is something that we all use. If you go to the grocery store and you look at a label on a can of applesauce to see what kinds of ingredients are in there, you are using data to make a decision about whether you think that's healthy enough that you want to buy it or if you think it's of enough value. We use data every day in an educational context as well. If a student doesn't show up for school for 10 days in a row, you're using that information to power your next steps, which might be calling the family. So we use data in very simple ways. We use it in very complex ways. Much more informative and rich data is increasingly more and more available because of lots of different educational initiatives, such as No Child Left Behind, the Race to the Top, and the Early Learning Challenge grants and other public policy. So my point here today is let's try to use what is out there already, and if we need to supplement, so be it, but there's tons of information that we can use to help make our decisions better. This guide and this presentation focuses on a specific set of steps that are recommended about how to use data and considerations for using it most effectively. So data and data teams. We talked about data a little bit. What is a data team? Well, a data team is simply a group of people that have come together around a particular issue, and they're pulling together different sorts of information to help them understand and respond to that issue. With folks in the educational community, often that would include an administrator. It might include a teacher. Certainly with dropout prevention, it would include a social worker, perhaps a school attendance officer, parents or students or other stakeholders that might be in the community. A data team might just be you and one other person. It doesn't have to be 20 people. So please don't think that that's a requirement. So another poll, please, for folks in Puerto Rico, would you raise your hand if you're participating in what I have described as a data team right now? Folks online, could you just indicate in the online polling there if you are participating or not participating or if you're uncertain? So it looks like from our virtual audience that, again, the majority are participating in what we've described as a data team. Well, right about half. About half of you, about 40% said no, about 10% are not certain. We're just waiting to see what our folks in Puerto Rico are indicating in terms of their participation in a data team. Mostly not in data teams, and one person is. Well, that's just fine, because hopefully as a result of this presentation today, you will feel more empowered and be able to connect with your peers in your school or community to start such a data team to work on issues that many stakeholders are going to be weighing in on. Thank you. So now to go to the 5 steps of the guide. This is what we're going to cover with the rest of our time here today. The first step is called setting the stage. What question is to be addressed in your data-informed conversation? The second step will be examining the data. The third step, understanding the findings. The fourth step, developing an action plan. And the fifth step, monitoring the progress and measuring the success of that plan. So step 1, setting the stage. This step identifies the question to be asked, the information needed to answer it, and the feasibility of accessing the information. Crafting a clear research question is crucial for enabling data-informed conversations. So your data team should start by framing the what question as simply as possible. Answering your what question can lead to other types of questions, such as those that look at relationships between 2 different things. So for example, in terms of dropout prevention, at the simplest level, your what question might be, what is causing the increase in our dropout population in our school? The sub-questions might be something like, is there a relationship between a student's grade level and the potential to drop out? Are they more likely to drop out as a junior, as a sophomore? Are girls more likely to drop out than boys? But start out with one big, simple what question and try to keep it very focused on that to the extent that you can. The biggest challenge I see when I work with local groups that are trying to do this kind of work is they make things way too complicated and they try to answer too many questions at once. So brainstorming with your group is a good way to start. I'm imagining for the folks in Puerto Rico, because of the initiative that you've come together around, you already have your what question. So for those of you that are virtual, I would love to hear if anybody has a research question they would like to share in the chat window about what they're working on right now. For folks in Puerto Rico, please just turn to a neighbor and talk about what you're working on right now. If you do have, even though you're not in a data team, what kinds of what questions would you be wanting to answer in your setting? And again, I would encourage our virtual audience, if you have anything you'd like to share, it makes our presentation so much richer when we have, quote, real problems that we're talking about. Okay, well, I'm not going to wait too much longer. Let's go ahead and just focus on this dropout prevention question. Oh, here comes somebody. What interventions work for our populations to re-engage with disconnected youth? Ah, that is a great question. What are the social and emotional gains made by students in urban low-income communities? What attendance interventions are most effective for high school students? These are all really great questions. Thank you folks so much for sharing. What age and grade do kids get off track? That is a really great question, and I think very applicable to the dropout prevention question. When does it start to happen? When do we start to lose these children? Okay, I'm going to go on to the next step. Setting the stage is actually still part of step 1, but some additional information that we need to get. After clarifying your question of interest, you or your team needs to identify the sources of information to answer that question. So what do the data reveal about, let's say, when students start to drop out? That requires access to the results of particular sources of information, attendance records, dropout and withdrawal records, perhaps other sources of information. Some schools have students complete engagement or cultural and climate surveys that might indicate when they are becoming disengaged. So what information do you need to answer that question? Is that information readily available? again, for the dropout prevention question, you might see some data that show that students start to drop out more frequently as juniors. We have lots of national databases and often state-level databases that can give us that information, but that may not help you answer why students are dropping out. So in terms of needing additional data, that would be when you might think about, well, we know that our students are dropping out at this age, but we really don't know why that might be happening. There's lots of different kinds of data that can be used to answer these kinds of questions. Typically, we see demographic data, which is simply descriptive data of students or families or communities, things like gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, descriptors about an organization, including enrollment and attendance. Perceptual data, get my little arrow back down here again. Oops. The perceptual data is going to be more of opinion or poll kinds of data. That includes how people feel or what they observe. So that could be how a student feels about school or how they feel about their teachers. It could be how parents feel about the school if they feel engaged. Performance data is information on how students are performing in their educational outcomes. So that could be completion of coursework. It could certainly be grades or scores on standardized tests, attendance rates, intention to apply to college or university. Could be lots of different information in terms of performance. Programmatic data is more descriptive information on how activities are conducted within your organization. So thinking back on some of the questions that you posed earlier, social emotional learning programs, early intervention programs. So programmatic data would be descriptive of those activities and those particular kinds of interventions, the frequency of them, the nature of them, their goals and intentions. So let's take another poll at this point about the kind of data that you are typically using now. I've just described these 4 main sources. Virtual audience, if you'd please check all that apply. And folks in Puerto Rico, if you could please raise your hand when your facilitator asks this question. How many of you are using demographic data right now? Again, descriptive of students, teachers, or families. How about perceptual or opinion data, often coming from surveys? Performance data, based on student outcomes primarily. And then programmatic data, that's describing the different kinds of programs, educational programs or intervention programs. So it looks like in our virtual audience, over 80% use demographic and performance data, and that would be exactly what I would expect. And in our audience in Puerto Rico, similarly, demographic data looks like one of the top ones, followed by perceptual, so opinion data. Programmatic data tends to be a little bit less frequently collected, although I would argue it is very important to understand what your program is doing, simply because you want to make sure that your program is meeting the needs of the children that it's serving. Thanks for your participation in that poll. So let's go on to the next step, examining the data. This is looking at the data for patterns as well as making initial observations and exploring any limitations of your data. So looking for patterns in the data and making a snapshot observation are a first step toward answering the question. For example, some questions, data from one period, such as one test or one school year, might be sufficient. For example, if your question related to math proficiency for the current school year, how are our children doing this year, you would only need 1 year of data. If you're looking at trends over time, coming back to that dropout question, why are our dropout numbers getting so high? You would be wanting to look at several years of data to look at trends. When you're looking at that data and looking over time, make sure you keep that what question in mind. That should be driving everything you do. Sometimes it is easy to get off track and start speculating about data, but we want to keep your goal, your what question, your research question at the forefront. One of the things you also need to look at are data limitations, because rarely is data perfect. There almost always seems to be issues with it somehow or another. Some of the issues that you might find is that you only have different sources of data. Maybe you had an attendance tracking system 3 years ago that has since been updated, and the way that attendance is being tracked that would inform dropout was originally by present versus absent at the beginning of the day, and now you're tracking total hours. So that would be kind of tricky to compare, so you want to be aware of that we can't effectively compare apples to oranges. So in addition to that kind of comparison data, you want to be certain of the quality of your data, because often we have a lot of missing data, it's not complete, and then we are left in a position of speculating about what is not there. You also want to be careful about the assumptions you make about your data, specifically the difference between a correlation and cause. So, for example, in dropout populations, you may see that males are more likely to be dropouts than females, but that does not infer that being a male causes you to be a dropout. It's a relationship. So we want to be cautious about that. And then also, while you're looking at your data and your results, you want to see if you can identify strengths or challenges right up front that may be helping you to answer your question. So strengths are results in the data that indicate a success, and challenges are results that indicate that something is blocking improvement or higher achievement. For example, while looking at middle school achievement data, a team might make the following observation about a possible success. Let's say each year between 2009 and 2012, students showed a 5 percentage point increase in average achievement scores between grades 6 and 7. That's definitely a success. Another observation that would be classified as a challenge would be, while we saw student math scores improve, the scores of male students actually declined. So those are some examples of things that you want to poke around in about your data and see what you can find. So let's have another question. Again, in Puerto Rico, this would be a question that you can talk with a neighbor about or your facilitator, the kinds of limitations in the data you have. They could be some of the limitations I've described already, or perhaps something else. We would love to hear your input from the virtual audience. If you could type into the chat window, what kinds of limitations are you seeing? Oh, great. It looks like many people are typing some of their challenges. I'm just going to read off some of these for the benefit of our audience in Puerto Rico. Difficult to get family involvement in collecting data. Oh my gosh, that is, I think, always the toughest nut to crack, is getting information from families and getting their involvement. Lack of consistency in data collection. Data silos, meaning that there are multiple systems that are not talking to each other. Bad data, changing methods of computing performance. That's often what I'm seeing too. As our standards are changing, we can't necessarily compare from year to year. Getting accurate pre- and post-intervention data. Data that accurately matches your programming, also very difficult. Very great. Thank you so much, folks, for entering your challenges in the chat window. There's obviously lots of challenges. Taking the time to get mixed methods data, both qualitative and quantitative, also a really great point, because as you all know, sometimes the numbers on paper don't really tell the whole story, and we really want to get the whole story, especially when it comes to something like a dropout prevention program, because we know that there are many things going on that might cause a student to drop out. Thank you so much for sharing your questions. And I think at this point we're going to take a pause for questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Myriam. And if you have any questions or any comments or any feedback, please type them into chat at this time. We're also going to see if we can unmute the lines in Puerto Rico so we can get some questions from the audience there, or any feedback on the previous polls and discussions we've done up until this point. I know we've covered them pretty quickly. It looks like we have a couple of questions coming in from the virtual audience. A request for these slides, yes, we will definitely provide a link for that. Some more questions are coming in, so we'll just give a couple of seconds here. As you can see, the slides can be downloaded from the box to the right of this chat window. Looks like we have no comments or questions from Puerto Rico. Are there any comments or questions from our virtual audience? We have one here from Kia Reed. Thanks so much for sharing a question. Is it appropriate to use these steps for structuring data to use with teachers in their assessment, reflection on instruction, or grouping students? How would you respond to that, Myriam?
I would say absolutely yes, although I think that in that situation, you're already up to step 3 or step 2 probably. I'm just thinking and reflecting on professional learning community conversations in schools that I have been a part of, where we are looking, I'm assuming, at academic data and trying to think about instructional approaches for different groups of students. But I would say absolutely, again, you already have your question, I think, identified when you start out with a team like that.
Great, thanks, Myriam. Here's a question from Puerto Rico. How important is the data we compile? We need to continue to reflect upon the feedback we get on the data in order to make decisions.
I'm not quite sure if I understand how important is the data that we compile. I would say data is, speaking from a research perspective, I think it's incredibly important. I would also say, and we will be talking about this a little bit more as we go on here in terms of monitoring your program success, you want to be able to look back on basically a baseline. Where did we start? If you're looking at dropout prevention and you start out with a particular number or percentage of students that you're seeing that are dropping out every year, you want to be monitoring that every year, whether that data is coming from your attendance system or whether it's coming from another source. If it's a different problem, you definitely want to compile it, keep track of it, so that you are, in fact, making database decisions and not just that shooting from the hip feeling like everything's better. So absolutely.
Great, thank you. And the person that posed that question really wanted to reaffirm the importance of doing continuous reflections on the data.
Absolutely.
So we have another question here. Can we get people to look at early elementary school attendance data? The dropping out process starts very early.
And I
That's
see
Steve Neff at Montgomery County Public Schools in Maryland.
And Steve, I really applaud you for thinking that way, because often when I've worked with school districts about attendance issues, they are unwilling to do that. The programs that I've seen that are most successful in turning around chronic truancy and impacting that dropout level do start in elementary school. Absolutely.
Thank you. We'll just give a couple more minutes here as I see some other questions coming in, and also take some brief pauses for translation there in Puerto Rico. If we have any other questions from the virtual audience, you can enter those in chat right now. We have a comment here from Lysandra Lopez Medina in Pennsylvania. She says, we have a dashboard and look at attendance, behavior, and course grades.
And I know that many school districts are going that route. I am actually, I'm here in Colorado, and our Denver Public Schools District has a very similar process where they've actually tried to establish a warning system of those combination of those different indicators to flag a student that's potentially at risk for disengaging.
Thank you, Lysandra. She notes that that dashboard is for middle school.
Mm-hmm. Great.
All right, I think we have one last question coming in here. We have a comment here from Steve Neff. Another hindrance in addressing truancy in teenagers is that state law indicates it is the parents who are breaking the compulsory attendance law, not the students. It's tough to hold the teens accountable when this is the case.
I would agree with that. We, in Colorado, in working on truancy and dropout prevention, that has always been a tricky point because obviously we want the parents to be engaged and to have some accountability because they are their parents. But at the same time, especially as the children are growing older into their teenage years, they need to develop that sense of personal accountability as well. And I would say that, you know, a really good truancy dropout prevention program would include components that help to develop those kinds of competencies in the kids in terms of personal accountability and an understanding of the impact of their actions on their future.
Thank you. Just a brief pause for translation. And we have a question here from Benjamin Robinson in Washington, D.C. He wants to know if dashboards and early warning systems have been proven to be causally related to improved outcomes. He thinks it's a wonky question, but I don't think it is at all. And he's wondering how much we know about the effectiveness of these. I know they're quite new.
Mm-hmm. And you know, Benjamin, I am not familiar with any causal research on that. Again, in Denver here, I know that they have seen some impact, but there, like in many school districts, are so many new initiatives happening at the same time, I think it would be difficult to tease things apart to directly link it to that dashboard. That's an excellent question. All you researchers out there, maybe somebody could take that one on.
And Myriam, do you know of any studies on relationships between dropout and school climate indicators?
I know of some research that's around specific components of school climate and dropout prevention, that whole sense of belonging piece for students. And, you know, of course, school climate is a broadly defined term in and of itself, and how we measure it isn't always as clean as it could be. But I would have to look back in some files, but I know that we did see some, especially around, again, that student self-reported sense of belonging as an impact on attendance and dropout prevention.
Thank you for that question, Eb. He's from Louisiana, Department of Education. And we have a comment here from Jared Robinson that research on early warning systems would likely lag 4 to 6 years after implementation. That makes sense.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, I would like to thank everyone for their comments and their questions. And if there aren't any more at this moment, and feel free to continue to type them in chat as they come to mind, we will move on to step 3.
Thank you, Claire. So step 3 is all about understanding your findings. You've gotten a question, you have looked at some data, you've made some preliminary observations about what you see as strengths and challenges in that data relative to your question and the target population. So understanding your findings, making observations about that data on a more detailed level is the basis for identifying the driving factors that underlie those patterns, strengths, and challenges, and for informing future action plans. For example, if you did identify with the dropout population example that you saw that males were more likely to be dropouts and earlier than females, that might lead you to ask another question. Now that I see that, why? Why is that happening? So step 3 is really about digging in and trying to find out about that underlying cause. The data team, or you as an individual, seldom would have the time to explore all of the challenges that you might uncover in the data. So again, extremely important to stay focused on your one question and to stay focused on the facts and to stay focused on something that you can truly impact in your setting. For example, I think probably everyone in our audience knows, especially if we're talking about an at-risk population, that there are lots of things that are happening for these children and youth outside of the school and outside of the school day that may be contributing to their likelihood of dropping out. Are those things in the school building that we can impact? Well, some of them we might be able to. We might be able to increase family engagement. We might be able to provide some kind of an intervention program that connects children with pro-social activities in the community or work activities or homework help. But it is important to recognize what you can and what you cannot impact. So stay focused on what you know that you can impact. And I recognize, and I'm assuming, I guess, with our folks down in Puerto Rico, that as social workers and counselors, you may have more connections in the community with community resources than a typical school teacher might. So again, that will vary for all of you depending on your setting. But in any case, we want to focus on an actionable challenge that you have driving factors that you can address or influence directly. And one way to identify the driving factors for a key challenge is to ask a series of why questions followed by a series of because responses. I'm going to advance to this next slide, which is taken right out of the guide. And if you have the guide, it's on page 11, and I apologize if it's not terribly clear. So I'm actually going to read some of these. So this is sort of like a decision tree, only it's not so much a decision as it is driving you to look deeper and deeper and deeper. For example, the key challenge I have listed on here is the number of middle school students who meet or exceed proficiency on math standardized tests has declined during the past 2 years. So your challenge question is why? Why have they declined? A potential driving factor or because answer is students spent less time on math topics. Okay, so then why did they spend less time on math topics? Potential driving factor underneath that is because math topics were not integrated throughout all subjects. Well, why were they not integrated in all subjects? So you see the process, it's driving you further and further and further till you get to a place where there is potentially a factor that you can impact, that you see as being logically and linearly related to what your problem statement is. And again, this blank template is in the back of the guide. It's something that you can print out to kind of walk through this process. So going on to step 4, now let's say you've identified what that underlying challenge is that you're going to address. And you want to make a plan of how to address it. Going back to the dropout prevention idea, let's say that the underlying cause that you've identified that you want to try to impact is that students are not interested and engaged in the curriculum. That's a common reason that I hear from students, especially at the high school level. They don't see it as relevant. They don't see it as important. They don't see how it might benefit them. So I'm going to make a plan with my data team to put something together to address that issue. So in developing this plan, to reduce the challenge and promote success is to identify, first of all, your key stakeholders will be involved. So stakeholders, again, could be the people that are on your data team. It could be a larger group of people. It could include parents that are concerned about the dropout level of children in their neighborhood. It could include other community resources. It could include representatives from the workforce. So identifying the key stakeholders that would be involved in putting together this plan to get students more highly engaged with the curriculum. Who would you want to have at the table? Without the support of key stakeholders, even the best plan is unlikely to succeed. So again, those stakeholders might include principals, curriculum and instruction specialists, assessment staff, teachers, parents, students, community members, and so forth. So careful planning will help you and your team take the right actions to tackle the challenge you have identified. Developing an action plan typically includes short-term objectives and a long-term goal. Short-term objectives allow for tracking progress and of identifying steps toward a larger goal. Having a long-term goal makes clear what the plan hopes to accomplish in the end. So in your data team, clarity and agreement on objectives and goals can be improved by using what we call the SMART system. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with that. And let's see here, I don't want to jump ahead too fast. I'm going to go on to that on our next slide. But as you get going on developing your goals and objectives, you really want to think about your plan. Is it feasible? For example, if you're trying to impact student engagement with the curriculum, you might think about bringing in community members to share about the work that they're doing that is tied to some of the curriculum that is being delivered, an engineer or a mathematician or a teacher. But you want to make sure that it's really something feasible that you can do. You may not be able to afford or have the time or the resources to do something more complex. When you're looking at your plan, you want to look at what is it we're trying to change. Are we trying to change students' reported level of engagement with the curriculum? When do we want to see that change occur? Do we want to see it this year? Does it need to happen by the end of the semester? Again, what's feasible? What kinds of resources will need to be in place to lessen that challenge and increase the probability of improvement? And then again, your activities, and are those activities feasible given what your available resources are? The SMART goals, and again, I apologize this is not as clear as it could be, also is in the guide. It is on page 10 of the guide if you have it to look at. The guidelines for SMART is specific, so again, keeping it very honed down to specifically what you're trying to accomplish, the people that are involved, what the goal seeks to accomplish, all of those constraints that will really help you to be clear about what you're trying to do. It's measurable. So if, again, we're trying to impact student engagement with the curriculum and interest, how are you going to measure that? Is that going to be by a survey? Is it going to be through a focus group? Is there another tool? It needs to be measurable so that you know you are making progress and you know when you have succeeded. Is it attainable? Is it reasonable to think that you can really get that kind of change happening in those students over the course of a school year or a semester or whatever you are trying to do? Is it relevant? So the goal needs to be meaningful to your stakeholder group, which of course in this case it would be because we've identified that dropout prevention is of high interest. And is it timely? You need to have a time frame, again, if it's going to be a semester, a school year, is it a 3-year plan, is it a 5-year plan? But it needs to be something very clear that you can communicate to others. This next slide is, again, another resource that's available in the guide that you can print out. It has the guidelines for SMART goals at the top. And then this is a place where you can actually brainstorm with someone or with your data team to identify resources, dates, milestones, activities, and so forth. It's just a helpful way to really do a check on yourself to make sure that what you're doing is something that you can succeed at. And then this next slide, template 6, is also in the guide. And it is on page 13. So further detail to support your development of your action plan and organizing your team. So this simply has the steps, the resources that are needed, your deadline, your responsibilities, who will do it, when they'll get it done. And coming back to one of the comments we had earlier, it's really essential that you monitor your own plan for success. And having it written down will enable you to do that better. So the final step is monitoring your goal's progress or your program's progress and measuring the success of the goal that you have. So data team members should regularly revisit their action plan. If the plan gets off track, and it often does, it doesn't mean that you're not doing a good job. It's just things that happen. Dropped responsibilities, staff turns over, unforeseen challenges happen. Suddenly there's something else that your boss has said is more important than this, and you have to shift around responsibilities. The team should try to troubleshoot to determine what to do to get the plan back on track. You may have to set it aside for a little bit, or someone else might have to take lead on it if you had been doing lead before. But keep regular meetings to monitor your progress. Team members should regularly check in with one another to identify challenges, make changes as needed, and celebrate your successes. Assessing your progress is essential in using data to achieve a desired improvement. As an action plan is being implemented, it is important to assess whether its strategies are being properly implemented. So one of the ways that you can do that is by setting milestones or benchmarks. For example, with the dropout prevention thing, let's say you use a survey of student engagement as a baseline, and you want to see a percentage improvement of 10% more engaged by the end of the first semester. Sometimes setting those milestones or benchmarks can be tricky because you might feel as if you're just guessing, and that's okay. It's always fine to go and readjust it later. I would always encourage you to aim a little bit lower than higher, because there's nothing worse than setting a goal and feeling like you can't even come close to meeting it. So in any case, set something specific. You know, we want to see this engagement improve by 10% by the end of the first semester. By the end of the first year, assuming that that engagement score improves, we expect to see a 5% reduction in dropouts compared to our baseline year. Some statement like that that again gives you something very specific to compare to, and use those frequent checks as needed. Okay, and I think we are going to do some more questions at this point.
Thank you so much, Myriam. So no questions have come through chat so far, but just reflecting on everything that we've learned up until this point, please type any comments, feedback, or questions that you have for Myriam into chat. And we'll also see if we have any comments or questions or feedback from our live audience in Puerto Rico. So we'll just wait a couple of seconds here. We especially welcome any questions, comments, or feedback that apply to your particular context and the work that you're doing. Perhaps any ideas for how you will use this information in your day-to-day work. And just to reiterate what we've put into the chat, that if you would like to print out copies of this PowerPoint from this presentation, and also the guide that Myriam is a co-author on and has been referencing, so that you can get these great templates. Those should be there on your screen to the right-hand side of the chat where it says download today's files. Looks like there are no comments from Puerto Rico. Are there any comments or questions from our virtual audience? I see one here from Paul Smith, who wants to know what advice you have to encourage, quote, reluctant teams.
That's a great question. Yeah, not everybody loves this work as much as we do, huh? I guess my only piece of advice about that is I try very hard to find the angle that makes this work personally meaningful for somebody. And for some people, it might be about their own job performance, about how much better it can make them look to improve these kinds of situations. For some people, it might, hopefully most of us, it's because we want to do things that are better for kids. But the other thing I guess I would say is I think many people are very intimidated by just the word data. And especially when you come around to terms of like research and investigation. So using people-friendly language and encouraging people to not let their fear of not knowing enough get in their way. That's part of why I typically open this kind of conversation with, if you read the back of a can of beans, then you are an informed user of data, because I think sometimes people overcomplicate that idea. But I think that's definitely a challenge. And I think especially because in school situations and community situations, everyone is so very busy. Having some storming, norming, forming kinds of meetings with the group to really get people personally engaged with the issue and get them passionate and excited about it, I think can be very helpful as well.
Thank you, Myriam. We'll just wait a couple more seconds as I see there may be a couple more questions. All right, it looks like there are no further questions or comments, and we will be finishing a little early today, but I think we've really gotten a lot of rich information in this brief amount of time. And actually reading the guide, it's very user-friendly, easy to read, and has those great templates and resources. Will give you the opportunity to digest the information more fully. And we want to make sure that everyone takes this brief stakeholder feedback survey. If you wouldn't mind following this link to complete the survey so that we can improve these offerings for you in the future. And it looks like we have one question coming in from Puerto Rico, or one comment. So let's wait for that. So we have a comment from our Puerto Rico audience that sometimes it feels like collecting data is not useful for some people.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to the reluctant data team member. I don't think that there is a simple, easy answer to that problem. I spend an awful lot of time trying to educate people about the value of data and help them, again, to overcome their intimidation about it. I think a lot of people may not recognize the value of the data because they don't understand how it can be used. And that would be where those of you that are more familiar with using data can be great advocates and helpers to just bring folks along. Because my experience has been once people do understand a little bit more about how data can be used, they're pretty excited about that because it's real information that they haven't had before. So just keep fighting the good fight. And I guess I shouldn't use the word fight. Keep trying to work with people and help them to understand how important it can be and have compelling examples to show about that.
Thank you so much, Myriam. Thank you to all of you for all of your questions and comments and for your participation today. Please, again, take a quick moment to complete this stakeholder feedback survey. And if you'd like further information about the work that REL Northeastern Islands does in Puerto Rico or in general, here is Sandra's email and my email. Also, the email address for Myriam Baker, our presenter, if you have any additional questions or feedback for her. We want to thank her so much for her time, and also we want to thank REL Pacific for helping us to facilitate and collaborate to do this important event.
Thank you.
Thank you,
All right,
everyone.
thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Claire, for moderating, and thanks so much, Dr. Baker, for the amazing presentation today. This concludes the REL Northeastern Islands Bridge Event webinar, and have a great rest of the day, and have a great rest of your professional development in Puerto Rico, everybody. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.